I would now like to introduce Con O'Brien. Con has presented to Solomos on a number of occasions, so he's an old friend of the Society, always exciting, always exhilarating, and we look forward to nothing less tonight. I'm not reading out the whole screen, but Con's talk is entitled my words are getting all tangled up. The Fall of Troy at the End of the Age of Heroes. Please welcome Con.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
It's always a pleasure to be here at Solomos. You have a couple of handouts. There's a map of the part of the world where our story takes place. On the back is my bibliography, and the other sheet is little snippets and phrases from verse and prose inspired by the Trojan War, ranging from Homer in around 700 BC up to poets and writers of the early 20th century. Now, some years ago, at Solomos, I told you of the events leading up to the Trojan War, and I finished that night with the death of Protesilaus, the first Greek victim of that war. Tonight, I go forward almost 10 years to the last days of the war, the Greek victory, and the terrible vengeance they wreaked upon the Trojans. It's a tale of heroism, betrayal, and the willful influence of the gods. We begin with the deaths of heroes. The combat between great Ajax, son of Telamon, and the Trojan champion, Hector, came about in this way. Paris, so Homer tells us, showing uncharacteristic courage, challenged Menelaus, Helen's husband, to single combat, with the prize being Helen herself. During this combat, Menelaus was proving too strong for Paris, so Aphrodite, goddess of love, enveloped the combatants in a fog so that Paris could flee unseen. Running through the gates of Troy, Paris hid in Helen's boudoir, while Menelaus strutted up and down in front of the Scaean gate, demanding that Helen be brought to him, the victor. Then they could all go home. The Greek and Trojan armies agreed. But then the goddess Athena, urged on by Zeus, whispered into the mind of Trojan archer Pandarus, who then loosed an arrow at Menelaus, wounding him only slightly, but enough to break the truce. The bitter war continued. Feeling the shame of Paris's cowardice, his brother Hector then issued a challenge for any one of the Greeks to face him in single combat. "I am not Paris," he said. "I am Hector, and Hector will not run away." The obvious Greek champion, Achilles, would not accept this challenge, as he was sulking in his tent over a slight from Agamemnon, the Greek commander-in-chief. So great Ajax stepped forward to face Hector, and what a contest it was. Homer tells us that after their spear casts proved ineffective, the two heroes fell upon each other like lions that eat raw meat, or wild boars whose strength is inexhaustible. They flung great stones, injuring each other badly. But such was their stamina, they fought on until dusk, when the heralds from each camp pronounced the combat finished. The two champions gave each other gifts. Such was their mutual respect. Hector gave Ajax a sword with a silver-nailed hilt, accompanied by a sheath and baldric of well-cut leather. And Ajax gave Hector a belt, brilliant with purple. Each gift would feature in the death of its recipient. Not long after this, in a battle, Hector killed Patroclus, who was Achilles' cousin, and this brought man-slaying Achilles back into the fray. He stalked and killed Hector in revenge for the death of Patroclus. With Hector lying helpless on the ground at his feet, Achilles taunted him, telling him he would not be buried, that the dogs and birds would eat of his flesh. With the insight sometimes granted to those who were dying, Hector responded with his last breath, "Remember me when Paris kills you in the Scaean Gate." Achilles took the belt brilliant with purple, and threading it through the Trojan hero's ankles, attached the other end to his chariot. He then drove in triumph around the walls of Troy, dragging Hector's corpse behind him. Hector's wife, Andromache, couldn't bring herself to watch this contest. She'd waited in her chambers. When she heard the wailing of the Trojan women as they saw Hector's body pulled through rocks and dirt and across thorn bushes, poor Andromache mistook that sound for cheering. Her heart leapt, thinking that Hector must have won. But when she ran to the walls of Troy and looking over saw the brutal treatment of her husband's body, she collapsed in horror to the ground. Achilles continued to disgrace himself, flinging Hector's body onto a garbage heap in the Greek camp and refusing to allow its burial. The very gods turned their faces away in shame. Aphrodite protected Hector's body from scavenging birds and animals by anointing it with immortal oil of roses. And Apollo covered the body with shade, so the power of the sun would not dry up flesh of limb and sinew. The divine messenger Eris brought Hector's father, King Priam of Troy, unseen through the Greek camp and into Achilles' tent. Priam's pleading for the body of his son softened the iron heart of Achilles. "Respect the gods then, Achilles, and have pity on me, remembering your own father. For I am yet more pitiable than he, for I have endured to do what no other mortal man on earth has ever done. I have brought to my lips the hands of the man who killed my child." There is a story that Achilles had sworn only to release Hector's body to his family in exchange for its weight in gold. And to this end, he set up gigantic scales before the walls of Troy. In one pan he placed Hector's body, while into the other the Trojans poured ingots, bracelets, ornaments, anything made of gold, in an attempt to balance the scales. They were not quite balanced, so one of Hector's sisters, Polyxena, leaning over the wall, tossed in her earrings and her bracelets. Now the scales were even. Some say that when Achilles saw Polyxena, he developed an instant passion for her. Others say that Achilles had seen Polyxena before and was already in love with her, that Priam and Hector had promised him he could have Polyxena if he betrayed the Greeks, or at the least persuaded them to leave Helen in Troy. But perhaps this is just Trojan propaganda. Achilles did not live long after Hector's death. He was shot with an arrow that pierced his heel. The arrow came from Paris's bow, but it is said that it was Apollo himself who guided the deadly missile. Achilles died in the Scaean Gate as the dying Hector had foretold. Everyone was stunned. Achilles had always seemed invincible. even though all of the oracles said that he must die at Troy. The Trojans ran forward in jubilation to strip him and steal his armour, as they had done with the armour worn by Patroclus. But the Greeks were not about to lose this precious set, made by the god Hephaestus himself. Great Ajax ran forward, and picking up Achilles' body, placed him over his mighty shoulder. Then, with Odysseus keeping the Trojans at bay, brought his body intact to the Greek camp. Now, even though the Greeks were still in shock at the death of Achilles, another question arose. Who among them was worthy to receive the armour of this great champion? Two warriors stood out from the others: Ajax, great Ajax, and Odysseus. The Greeks looked to their leader, Agamemnon, king of men, for a decision. Agamemnon did make a decision. He decided not to make a decision. His reasoning was thus: the Trojans know who the bravest of the Greeks are. They've been fighting us for 10 years. Let's ask them. It is said that he sent people to hide beneath the great walls of Troy and listen to the gossip of the Trojan men and women on the walls. That other spies were sent in among the Trojan prisoners of war to ask them. Opinions varied. Here's a couple of samples. First Trojan. Ajax was the bravest of the Greeks. When Achilles was killed, he picked him up and, careless of danger, brought him back to the Greek camp. Second Trojan. A big, strong woman could have done what Ajax did, but no woman could have done what Odysseus did, keeping hundreds of fighting Trojans at bay to protect Ajax and his precious burden. No, Odysseus is the bravest of the Greeks. Agamemnon inclined to the second point of view. So with great ceremony, he awarded the golden armour to Odysseus. Ajax left the king of men's quarters that evening with tears in his eyes and rage in his heart. It is then suggested that he drank copious quantities of wine before seeking revenge for the deadly insult he believed Agamemnon and Odysseus had given him. In the late hours, he returned to Agamemnon's tent. Mad with jealousy and rage, he killed Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus. Covered in blood, he then sought out Odysseus, killing several Greeks who tried to prevent him. Binding the wily Ithacan, he dragged him to his tent and tied him to the centre pole. Ajax tortured Odysseus, all the while teasing him, reminding him of how he had tried to avoid coming to Troy by pretending to be mad, only to be caught out by Palamedes. Ajax further taunted Odysseus, reminding him of the revenge that he'd taken upon Palamedes, having him framed on a charge of treason and stoned to death. Eventually, the quantities of wine that Ajax had drunk told on him, and he passed out. When he awoke to daylight, he saw bound to his tent centre pole a thickly wooled ram from the flock which the Greek army kept for food. The ram was dead, having been horribly wounded in many parts of its body and head. Ajax's clothing was stiff with blood, none of it his. Eventually the truth emerged. Ajax had been driven insanely delusional by the goddess Athena as punishment for having refused her assistance in one of the war's early battles. Sophocles takes up the story. Divine Athena came to urge him on and told him where to lay about his enemies. He answered blasphemously, "Holy One, give your assistance to some other Greeks. The line won't break where I am in command." Athena never forgot or forgave a slight, real or imagined. Ajax had gone on a drunken, murderous rampage, but Athena had led him to the food animals in their yards and pens. Unfortunate stockmen and shepherds were the first ones he'd killed. Ajax had then gone on to slaughter helpless sheep in the belief that he was killing Agamemnon and Menelaus. So now, in the light of day, great Ajax finally saw the truth. He had disgraced himself, shamed his family, and wished he could die. He took the sword given to him by valiant Hector and pressed its silver-nailed hilt firmly into the ground inside his tent. And then he fell upon it. The poet Pindar tells us that when Ajax was an infant, his father Telamon had been visited by Heracles himself. As a favour to Telamon, Heracles placed his cloak, which was the hide of the Nemean lion, over the little boy and asked his father Zeus to protect the child's skin as the lion had been protected. So after that, there was only one vulnerable place on Ajax's body, a small spot under his shoulder. And this was where Hector's sword pierced his body, killing him. His blood soaked into the earth, and from it there grew an iris. The markings on its petals recall Ajax's name. It may also be translated as alas. No one mourned more deeply the loss of Ajax than Odysseus himself. He resolved to give the golden armour to Achilles' son Neoptolemus. And when Agamemnon refused Ajax a proper funeral, Odysseus did not flinch. He shamed the king of men and won for Ajax this final dignity. He said, "He was the bravest man I ever saw, the best of all that ever came to Troy, save only Achilles. It is against all justice for you to treat him with contempt. God's laws and not the man himself you would annihilate. Even if you hate him, it is against all justice to lift your hand against a good man dead." It was Prince Antenor of Troy who, so Homer tells us, once said of Odysseus, when he let that great voice go from his chest, and the words came drifting down like the winter snows, that no mortal man beside could stand against Odysseus. Indecisive Agamemnon couldn't stand against him. So great Ajax received the final honours befitting such a great hero. And now, the fall of Troy. Agamemnon went to his soothsayer Calchas and told him that the prophesied 10 years at the walls of Troy were now up. When would Troy fall? Calchas responded that the Greeks had ignored two of his earliest prophecies. Troy would not fall without the bow and arrows of Heracles and Achilles' son Neoptolemus must be among the besiegers. Heracles' weapons were in the possession of a Greek soldier, Philoctetes. 10 years before, Philoctetes had been marooned on the island of Lemnos by the other Greeks because of a noisome snakebite wound. Neoptolemus was still on the island of Skyros with his mother Didamia and her father, King Lycomedes. Odysseus and Diomedes were given the task of bringing back to Troy Neoptolemus and the bow and arrows of Heracles. Getting Neoptolemus was easy. His grandmother, the sea goddess Thetis, was perfectly happy for him to go to Troy because she knew he would survive, unlike her son, the ill-fated Achilles. But getting Heracles' weapons from Philoctetes was more difficult. However, the ever-resourceful Odysseus tricked Philoctetes and stole the weapons. But then, surprisingly, Neoptolemus insisted that Philoctetes come back to Troy with them. On his arrival back at Troy, Philoctetes was cured of his horrible wound by Podalirius, a Greek army doctor whose father was the god Apollo. So Philoctetes was now back in his rightful place as a Greek army officer. He quickly proved his worth by killing Paris. His arrows had been dipped in the poisonous blood of the Lernaean Hydra, Heracles' second labour. When he loosed this arrow at Paris, the arrow point scraped across Paris's ribs, and soon he was in unbearable pain. Paris begged to be taken to Wenone, the wood nymph that he had deserted for Helen. So under cover of darkness, he was carried on a litter to her Mount Ida home. Wenone refused to heal him, reminding him of how he had betrayed her with Helen and told the bearer to take him back to Troy. On his arrival back at Troy, Paris died in agony. There is a story that when his funeral pyre was blazing, a woman ran from the crowd, leapt up onto the pyre, and was burned to death embracing Paris's body. It was Wenone. Some optimistic Trojans thought that this would be the end of the war, that with Paris dead, Helen could be returned to Menelaus, the Greeks would go home, and there would be peace. But a younger brother of Paris, Deiphobus, claimed Helen for himself. And so the war continued. Once again, Agamemnon went to Calchas the soothsayer and wanted to know when all of this was going to end in a Greek victory. Because it seemed to the weary Greeks they had spent the last 10 years fulfilling prophecies and forecasts laid down by oracles and seers. Here's a list of some of them. Achilles must fight in the Trojan War and die in battle. That's been done. Troy would never fall if Troilus, a son of Priam and Hecate, reached the age of 20. Achilles ambushed the lad in Apollo's sanctuary on Mount Ida and killed him a month short of that age. One of Priam's allies, King Rhesus, arrived at Troy with a herd of beautiful white horses. Calchas warned the Greeks that if once those horses passed through the gates of Troy, the city would never fall. Odysseus and Diomedes raided Rhesus's camp, killed the king and his men, and stole the horses. So Agamemnon felt entitled to say to Calchas, "When will Troy fall?" Calchas said the city would never fall as long as the Palladium remained inside the city. The Palladium was a large black stone, possibly a piece from a meteorite, and supposedly bore an image of Athena. Certainly it had pride of place in Athena's temple in the centre of Troy. The Trojans called it the Luck of Troy. Odysseus and Diomedes were given the assignment of stealing this talisman of Troy. To prepare for this assignment, Odysseus had some of the common soldiery beat him severely, so that with his bleeding cuts and bruises he presented as a woe-begone beggar. Then, along with Diomedes, entered Troy through the city's drains. The two spies wandered around the city, noting anything that may be useful to their side. In a marketplace they encountered Helen. She knew Odysseus at once, even through his bruises and injuries, and she made a great fuss of this unfortunate beggar, insisting on taking him to her chambers and having her servants wash him and feed him. When this had been done, she dismissed the servants and began to talk seriously to Odysseus. Odysseus didn't quite trust her, but tried to find out what he could from her. It was plain that she hated Deiphobus. It was also plain that she was still subject to spells from Aphrodite, the goddess very much on the side of the Trojans. Hecate, queen of Troy, walked into the room. She knew Odysseus at once. Odysseus waited for her to denounce him. In a moment he would be captured and killed, and there was nothing he could do. But Hecate wanted to talk with him. She began to bargain with him for the safety of her family when Troy had fallen. No firm bargain was struck, but in the end Odysseus was able to leave safely. He found Diomedes, they stole the Palladium, and they left the city the way they'd come in, through the drains. They walked across the no man's land between the walls of Troy and the palisades of the Greek camp, a place of ghosts, corpses, and scavenging birds and animals. Diomedes led. On his back, he carried the strange black stone. Odysseus followed. The moonlight shone on the Palladium and reflected into Odysseus' face. A strange thing happened. Odysseus drew his sword and began stalking Diomedes. Then he stopped. When Diomedes no longer heard footsteps behind him, he also stopped. And turning, saw Odysseus, sword in hand, and a look of blank horror on his face. Diomedes took the sword from his friend and turned him around and beat him with the flat of the sword, driving him back to the Greek camp. Some say that Odysseus was not mesmerised by the moonlight and the Palladium, but wanted sole credit for capturing the Luck of Troy and was willing to kill his friend rather than share the glory. Some commentators, especially Roman ones, are always suspicious of Odysseus and his motives. Odysseus wanted an end to this war, and so he conferred with Epaios. No, not the boxer who's featured in the Iliad, but an architect of the same name. Some say it was Athena who put into Epaios' head the idea of building a wooden horse. Certainly, Athena was always fond of Odysseus. She seemed to have taken no offence when he stole the Palladium from her temple, and she helped him with this daring scheme. Odysseus sent men to the forest of Mount Ida for timber to build the horse with, and he built the walls of the Greek camp higher to block the Trojans' view of their activities. At last, the great wooden horse was complete. Roger Lancelin Green, in his much-loved book, The Tale of Troy, describes the horse. Its hollow body was in size like that of a curved ship. The neck bore a purple fringed mane sprinkled with gold. The head had eyes of amethyst, surrounded by gems of sea green beryl. The mouth contained rows of jagged white teeth and a gold bit with a jewelled bridle. There were secret air holes in the nostrils, in the wide mouth, and in the wide pricked ears. The flowing tail was twisted with gold and hung with tassels. The hooves were shod with bronze, and mounted with polished tortoiseshell, under which were set wheels, so the horse might move easily over the ground. In the belly of the horse was a cunningly hidden trapdoor, which opened from the inside. 30 men hid inside that horse. They included Odysseus himself, Epaios, Menelaus, Teucer, who was great Ajax's half-brother, Weleus' son, also Ajax, and known as Little Ajax, to distinguish him from great Ajax, Telamon's son. Among the warriors were Theseus' sons, Acamas and Demophon. They had come to Troy to rescue their grandmother Athena, who was Helen's handmaid. The fateful morning dawned, bright and clear. Watchers on the walls of Troy saw and heard no movement in the Greek camp far below them. Scouts cautiously probed the perimeters and found, to their joy and amazement, the Greeks had gone. No men, no ships, nothing. The news spread. People came down through the city gates to see for themselves. There was something on the plain that hadn't been there yesterday. A horse, but such a horse. Enormous, spectacular, even beautiful. And most curious was the plaque around its neck. For their return home, a thank offering to Athena from the Greeks. The Trojans rejoiced. The war was over. They had won. Their beautiful city, their homes were safe. Cassandra, a daughter of Priam and Hecate, had once been blessed by Apollo with the gift of true prophecy. Then, when she denied him her body, had been cursed by him. She would still prophesy truthfully, but no one would ever believe her. Cassandra shouted out that the horse contained armed soldiers who would cause the destruction of Troy. No one believed her. Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, came down from the city with his sons. He laughed at the foolish Trojans dancing around the giant horse. "I fear the Greeks most when they bring us gifts," he proclaimed. And he flung a spear at the horse. When the sound of the spear striking its flanks was echoed by a clang from inside the horse, people became curious. But then 2 huge serpents swam up out of the sea and crushed Laocoon and his sons to death. The sea god Poseidon, like Hera and Athena, wanted the destruction of Troy. Another incident occurred. Soldiers found a man hiding in the dunes. His name was Sinon, and he told a startling story. He said that he was a cousin of Palamedes, and as such hated Odysseus. He told the Trojans that Odysseus had selected him, Sinon, to be a human sacrifice to the gods so the Greek fleet could sail home in safety. He'd escaped and hid in the dunes. He pointed to the yellow ribbons round his brow as proof that the Greeks had prepared him for this gruesome ceremony. He said he owed no more allegiance to them, and he gave the Trojans certain information. He told them that Calchas, the prophet, had said that any city which housed this enormous horse would be eternally safe from conquest. He pointed out that the horse was too big to fit through any of the gates of Troy. Further evidence, he said, of the cunning of Odysseus. Priam and his advisers decided to bring the horse up into the city and place it in the courtyard next to Athena's temple. Hordes of eager, ecstatic Trojans pushed the horse, which rolled smoothly on its wheels, up to the gates of Troy. They broke down part of the wall to bring it through. Where the horse now stood in the courtyard of Athena's temple became the scene of the happiest night Troy had experienced in a decade. Music, drink, dancing, love-making were all part of the joyous celebrations of the delighted Trojans. When the party was at its height, Aphrodite made one last attempt to save the city. She put a spell on Helen, who was walking around the horse, accompanied by Deiphobus. "Suppose, my lord Deiphobus," said Helen, now firmly in Aphrodite's power, "that the Greek kings, Menelaus, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, and the rest, were all shut up inside this horse? We must have it broken open at once, said Deiphobus. There is a better way, said Helen. If they are there, I will lure them out. All her life, Helen had excelled in mimicry. She now walked round and round the horse, speaking softly and seductively in the voices of the wives and lovers of the men inside the horse. As she continued, the Greeks, who had not seen their families in 10 years, were hard put not to answer. They crouched in the darkness, tears leaking from their eyes, biting their lips as they heard the sweet voices of their women. The youngest Greek, Anticlus, could not resist his wife's voice. He attempted to answer, but the ever-alert Odysseus clapped his hand over the young man's mouth. Anticlus persisted, but Odysseus's iron muscles were equal to the task. The harder Anticlus tried to speak, the firmer Odysseus's grip. Helen walked away, and the threat was gone. Odysseus removed his hand, but Anticlus was dead. Odysseus had suffocated him. In the darkness of the horse's interior, the Greeks shed tears for their comrade who had died for his love. Back in her chambers, Helen, now free from Aphrodite's spell, was disgusted with herself. She took a lamp and, going to her window casement, she lit the lamp, covered it with a red shade, and placed it in the window so it could be seen from a long way out to sea. Meanwhile, Sinon, apparently forgotten by the Trojans, built a fire on the tomb of Achilles between the city walls and the seashore. Watchers on the island of Tenedos saw Helen's light and Sinon's fire and gave Agamemnon the signal to move. In the late hours, Epaios cautiously opened the trapdoor and peered out. He heard nothing but the occasional snore. One of the younger Greeks, Echion, impatient to be at the enemy, pushed past Epaios before he could lower the rope for them to climb down. The lad was brave, but thoughtless. He plunged to the stone floor of the courtyard and was killed. The Greek ships had quickly returned. Landing crafts beached. Soldiers eagerly ran up to the gates of Troy, now open to the armies of Greece. What took place now was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Trojans, delirious with what they had supposed to be victory, had not even posted guards. Their fighting men were mostly asleep where they fell, in drunken stupor. Menelaus and Odysseus, now out from their hiding place, were among the first to see what was happening. They saw a son of Prince Antenor running to his home, and they recognised him. 10 years before, Menelaus and Odysseus had been sent by Agamemnon as ambassadors to Troy to ask Priam to send Helen home. Paris had paid assassins to kill them. Their lives were saved by Antenor, who was conscious of his duties towards his guests. So now Menelaus commanded that a leopard skin be draped across the entrance to Antenor's home as a sign that the dwelling and all in it were under his protection. Agamemnon, entering through the Scaean gate, came upon Aeneas, who was escorting his wife Creusa and his son Ascanius out of Troy and to safety. On his back, Aeneas carried his crippled father Anchises. Agamemnon, impressed with such filial piety, gave orders that Aeneas and his family were to be allowed to leave in safety. Acamas and Demophon, sons of Theseus, found their grandmother Athena and escorted her gently out of the maelstrom that was Troy. They treated her as if she was the most beautiful and gracious of queens, and ensured that she arrived safely back to her home in Athens. It's said that these two heroes took no part in the looting and treasure hunting, but accepted their only reward to be the safety and return home of their beloved Yaya. These are some of the stories of that night, which are pleasurable to recount. There are others. Neoptolemus, so kind and thoughtful in the matter of Philoctetes, was a different man when he had tasted blood. He chased the 15-year-old Prince Polites through the streets of Troy, finally killing him in front of his father, King Priam. Priam protested, saying that Neoptolemus' father, Achilles, would never have done such a brutal thing. Neoptolemus replied, "If you think so highly of my father, go and join him." With that, he stabbed the king to death. Little Ajax was a model of brutal and licentious soldiery. He raided Athena's temple and attempted to ravish her priestess, the prophetess Cassandra. Cassandra screamed and clung for protection to Athena's statue. But Ajax brutally tore her from the statue and began dragging her from the temple. The statue rolled its eyes in horror at this sacrilege. The air shook with a bellow of thunder, and the temple pillars split from top to bottom. This shook the pillaging Greeks, and Agamemnon was horrified. He had spent 10 years attempting the conquest of this most famous city of Asia. Countless lives had been lost. Mountains of gold had been expended. He had even sacrificed his own daughter Iphigenia in pursuit of this goal. Now it had all been put at risk by one madman who seemed to want to outrage Athena, the goddess of war. And all because of one woman. Agamemnon sent for Ajax and formally banished him from the Greek camp. Ajax was unrepentant. He stormed off, cursing Agamemnon, Odysseus, and the rest of the Greeks, ordering his men to set sail. Out on the water, his tirade continued, including in his abuse Athena, Poseidon, and the rest of the gods. It was a dangerous move, that, as he was floating in Poseidon's element. Zeus flickered a warning lightning flash, but Ajax paid no heed. His abuse continued. With a thunderous roar, a bolt of lightning smashed into Ajax's craft. When the air cleared, his ship was only bits of timber bobbing in the water. Ajax, clinging to a floating spar, shook a fist at the sky and yelled, "Call yourselves gods! You can't even kill the ones who insult you!" The next bolt of lightning sent him down to Hades. Back in Troy, Agamemnon went down to Athena's temple to apologise for Ajax's behaviour and saw Cassandra for the first time. He liked what he saw, and as commander of the conquering forces, he took possession of her. Cassandra had said no to Apollo after he had given her the gift of true prophecy, and Apollo had accepted her decision. So what Apollo respected, Agamemnon violated. This is hubris. Agamemnon's actions attracted the interest of Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. The Greek herald Talthybius told Hector's widow Andromache that her infant son Astyanax was to be thrown to his death from the battlements of Troy. The Greek leaders had decided the child must die. "We want no more kings of Troy," said Odysseus. The distraught mother wailed to her infant son, "Your father's greatness, which to so many brought hope and victory, will cost you your life. His courage to you proved a fatal heritage." It is said that it was Odysseus himself who carried out this threat and tossed the little boy to his death from the highest point of Troy. His little broken body was laid on the great shield of his father in preparation for his funeral, while the Trojan women prisoners mourned around it. They soon had more mourning to do. The ghost of Achilles rose from his grave and, appearing to the Greeks, roared at them, "Greeks, can you forget me when you go? Is gratitude for my fine feats of arms to be interred with me? It shall not be so. My tomb must have its honour. To appease Achilles' shade, your sacrifice shall be Polyxena." Polyxena was pulled from the protective embrace of her mother by Odysseus and his soldiers. Hecate pleaded for her daughter's life, reminding Odysseus how she had spared him when she'd surprised him in Helen's chambers. But Odysseus was not moved. "The first man of our army, Achilles, must be given your daughter as the sacrifice he demands of us." Neoptolemus did not argue with either mother or daughter. He slew Polyxena on his father's tomb. When the Trojan prisoners of war were given out as prizes of war to the Greeks, in cruel irony, I'm going to write this down here because I think it's probably best I do so. In cruel irony, Andromache was given to Neoptolemus, son of the man who killed her husband Hector. Neoptolemus also took Helenus, a son of Priam and Hecate, and a noted seer. He was also Cassandra's twin brother. I'm going to leave Troy for a little while now and follow the fortunes of Neoptolemus and those he connected with. When he sailed away from Troy, Neoptolemus did not return to the island of Skyros to his mother Didymia. He sailed on until he reached Epirus, where he had inherited the kingdom. I can see I have done this quite badly, this work on here. That's why I had to cross that out. So you'll have to follow very carefully to see all the bloodlines and so on. So one of the first things that he did when he arrived at Epirus was to father a son, Molossus, on his slave woman Andromache. The next thing he did was to steal Hermione, daughter of Menelaus and Helen, from her husband Orestes, who was the son of, see what I mean about having to jump around here, was the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Are you with me so far? Okay. Now, this theft of Orestes' wife Hermione by Neoptolemus was made easy because Orestes at that point had been driven mad by the Furies. As punishment for his having murdered his mother Clytemnestra. He killed Clytemnestra in revenge for her having murdered his father, her husband, Agamemnon, on his return home from Troy. Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon in revenge for his murder, that is, sacrifice, of their daughter Iphigenia. He had made a sacrifice of her 10 years before at Aulis to placate the goddess Artemis so she would send favourable winds for the Greek fleet to sail to Troy. Now, Clytemnestra not only murdered Agamemnon, she left no loose ends at all. She also killed Cassandra, who had accompanied Agamemnon home to Mycenae. Cassandra, of course, had prophesied all of this, but as usual, nobody took any notice of her. While Hermione was the queen of Epirus, she was jealous of Andromache because the slave woman had given Neoptolemus a son and she hadn't. When Orestes had been purified of his blood crime and regained his sanity, he wanted his wife back. He knew that he was no match in single combat for Neoptolemus, so he hired assassins to set an ambush for Neoptolemus when he next went to Delphi. The ambush was successful. Neoptolemus was killed, and Orestes was able to reclaim his wife Hermione. This left the kingdom of Epirus without rulers. So Andromache, with the prestige of having produced an heir for the next generation of kings, married her fellow slave Helenus, and the two of them became king and queen of Epirus. Not bad for a couple who'd arrived there as slaves. Virgil, in his Aeneid, tells us that they turned the place into a miniature Troy. I've always seen Helenus as a gentle sort of a fellow, albeit a bit eccentric, and I'm pleased that Andromache was once again able to gain some joy from life. Let us return now to Troy and look at the reunion of Helen and Menelaus. In my readings about Troy, I often come upon the story of the Starstone. This blood-red jewel was waiting for Helen in Athena's temple when she first arrived in Troy, and we're told that she wore it as a pendant during those long years in the besieged city. I'd never used the Starstone in any of my previous tellings of this story because I'd been unable to verify its existence in any ancient source. Recently, however, I came upon some writings by Maurus Servius Honoratus, who, so the Oxford Classical Dictionary tells us, is the author of a celebrated commentary on Virgil. He wrote in the 9th century AD. Now the OCD goes further. Servius based his writings on an earlier work, now lost, by a certain Aelius Donatus, who wrote in the 1st century AD. And it was Donatus who told the story of the Starstone. The Starstone, in moments of stress during Helen's time in Troy, wept tears of blood, which disappeared before they settled on her flesh or on her clothing. On the night that Troy fell, Helen, having placed the lamp in her window, waited anxiously. Soon the whole world seemed full of flames and shouts of pain, fear and anger. Her latest possessor, Deiphobus, still drunk from the evening celebrations, staggered down to the square to investigate. In the streets below, Menelaus and Odysseus cut and hacked their way towards Helen's chambers. They saw Deiphobus. Menelaus charged at him, slashing at him with his sword and shouting that he wished it was Paris he was killing. Odysseus held back, and Menelaus, having killed Deiphobus, climbed the stairs to Helen's chambers. He broke through the door and stood in the first room. Helen came out of the shadows and looked at him with fear in her wonderful eyes. Now surely, Menelaus must have thought of the thousands who had been killed or maimed because of this woman and her beauty, and a terrible urge must have swept through him. But then he saw the Starstone on her breast, dripping red tears onto her snowy white raiment. The drops fell, settled, then disappeared, leaving no stain. And Menelaus would have realised there was no stain on Helen either. Their love had been interrupted, not broken, by the spells of Aphrodite. He let his sword fall to the stone floor. Helen, he said. She came to him, and perhaps in that embrace, some of the loneliness and bitterness of the years may have been washed away. When Menelaus appeared with Helen the next morning, there would have been mixed feelings among the Greeks, but among Hecabe and the captive Trojan women there was no disagreement at all. Here is what Hecabe had to say. Menelaus, be worthy of yourself and set the seal on the Greek victory. Kill Helen and establish in all lands this law that every wife unfaithful to her husband dies. Hecabe knew that it was all Helen's fault. No blame could be attached to her son Paris. As gracious hosts to Odysseus' son Telemachus, they tell some of the stories of that journey. And at the end of their lives, Menelaus and Helen did not die, but were made immortal by the goddess Hera and transported to the Elysian fields. I find Helen a character worthy of respect. Like Odysseus, she is highly intelligent. Her speeches in both the Iliad and the Odyssey reveal a person of great insight. She had a loving yet innocent relationship with Paris' brother Hector. When Paris disgraces himself and his family by fleeing the combat with Menelaus, it is Helen who sums up the situation for Hector. It is your mind more than any that the war's work besets, all for the sake of the bitch I am and the blind folly of Paris. On we too Zeus has set a doom of misery, so that in time to come we may be themes of song for men of future generations. Helen's lament for her friend Hector at the end of the Iliad is beautiful and shows her to be a person of empathy and compassion. Hector, dearest to me by far of all my husband Paris' brothers, I have never heard a hard word from you or any rudeness. If anyone spoke harshly to me, then you would speak winning words to them and stop them with your own gentle-hearted words and your gentle way. And so I weep in anguish of heart, both for you and for my own ill-fated self. There is no one now to be kind to me and be my friend. They all shudder with loathing for me. Euripides, in two of his plays, and the light-hearted Helen, believes in Helen's intelligence and abilities. Her speech in the former play to Menelaus and Helen and their responses shows clearly that Helen's intelligence is far superior to that of Menelaus and the vengeful Hecabe. Hecabe was given to Odysseus as his slave, which pleased her not at all. Euripides tells us that she turned into a black dog, jumped over the side of the ship and was drowned. Her tomb, Sinosema, the bitch's tomb, a landmark of sailors of antiquity, lies at the entrance to the Hellespont on the Thracian bank. Calchas, soothsayer to Agamemnon, had the Greek army's trust for 10 years, and he grew pompous. After the fall of Troy, at the coastal city of Colophon, I was told how to pronounce this before, in Mysia, he met a seer cleverer than himself. This gifted man was Mopsus, a son of Apollo and Manto. Manto is the daughter, or was the daughter, of the great Theban seer Tiresias. So you can see Mopsus had an impeccable pedigree to become an outstanding prophet. Mopsus challenged Calchas to a test in the art of divination, and of course Calchas had to accept. Calchas asked Mopsus, "How many figs is that tree bearing?" Calchas replied, "1 bushel and 1 fig left over." And they tested this, and it was absolutely correct. Now, Mopsus asked Calchas, "How many piglets is that pregnant sow carrying?" Mopsus looked at the sow. 8, he replied. Mopsus gave a patronising smirk. The sow has 9 piglets in her womb. All of them are male, and will be born tomorrow at the 6th hour. This was absolutely true. The disconcerted Calchas collapsed and died. Mind you, I think the bit about the 6th hour, that was just showing off. Diomedes fought bravely all through the Trojan War, and he went on many dangerous and always successful missions with Odysseus. He was among the first Greeks to reach home. Wasn't a happy homecoming. His wife, Athena, had been unfaithful to him and had installed her lover as the king of Argos in his place. Diomedes attempted to mount an insurrection against them, but the Argive citizens wouldn't support him. Disgusted, Diomedes went to Italy, where, so Ovid tells us, he founded a great city, Athena. Perhaps his wife's unfaithfulness may have been Aphrodite's revenge for this incident. Homer tells us that in one of the battles during the Trojan War, Diomedes had fought Aeneas, who was Aphrodite's son, and had overpowered him and was about to kill him. Aphrodite covered Aeneas in a cloud so that Diomedes couldn't see him, and prepared to whisk him away as she had done with Paris in his fight against Menelaus. Now, cunning Diomedes sensed that Aphrodite was in that cloud, so he thrust his spear into it. A squeal from the goddess rewarded him. He had wounded her wrist. He shouted out to Aphrodite to leave the fighting to the soldiers and stick to her own craft. Aphrodite. I knew I'd mention it. Okay. Never mind, I've been dicing with that already. Aphrodite, howling with pain, flew to Olympus and sought out her mother, Dione. She sat on Dione's lap to be comforted and cried from the pain in her wound. Athena and Artemis, robust warrior goddesses, laughed at Aphrodite's discomfort. In the same afternoon, Homer tells us, Diomedes threw a spear at Ares, god of war. And once again he hit his target. And Ares was no more stoic than Aphrodite had been. Howling with rage and pain, he flew to Olympus and demanded of Father Zeus that he stop men thinking they could fight against the gods. Zeus's reply was along these lines: "You're a bully and a coward. I would have buried you in deepest Tartarus long ago, only then your mother Hera would have made my life a misery for all eternity. Get out of my sight." Diomedes was fortunate in getting home without incident, even though he didn't like what he found there. Many of the Greeks had enormous difficulties before their ships finally beached on their home shore. Some of them never made it at all. Palamedes, that clever man who had seen through Odysseus' feigned madness, was a son of Nauplius. Nauplius was infamous as a pirate and a wrecker. He would put up false beacons to lure ships into unsafe waters. When the ship crashed, Nauplius and his gang would board the ship, kill anyone who hadn't drowned, and steal anything worth stealing. He now had his son's death by a false charge of treason to spur him on. Many Greek ships sailing home from Troy became victims of this cruel man. I told you earlier that the sons of Theseus, Acamas and Demophon, saw their grandmother Aethra safely home to Athens. Now, that wasn't strictly accurate. Achaeus took her home to Athens. Demophon just kept wandering around the Aegean. Seemed as if he didn't want to go home. He fetched up in Thrace, where he met Princess Phyllis, the ruler of Thrace. Phyllis fell madly in love with the dashing Greek adventurer, and he responded. A whirlwind courtship, followed by marriage, made both of them happy. But then the restless Demophon wanted to go home to Athens for a visit, or so he told his bride. Phyllis replied that the laws of Thrace said that the king, for so she now addressed him, was forbidden to leave the country. Demophon must have been persuasive, because in the end Phyllis allowed him to go to Athens for a visit if he promised to come back. Demophon readily promised. But then Phyllis gave him a small jewelled box and told him after he had been away from Thrace for exactly 1 year, he was to open the box. Demophon laughed and said he would be back long before then, but Phyllis insisted, so he took the box. He didn't go anywhere near Athens. He just resumed his wanderings around the Aegean, the Aegean's ports, and he even got down into the Mediterranean, where he ended up in Cyprus. In Cyprus, he ran into Menelaus. Menelaus, by now, had managed to lose Helen again.
Oh dear.
Having the two of them in different ships was never a good idea. But it so happened that on the day they met, Demophon had been away from Thrace for exactly 1 year. Menelaus watched as the wanderer opened the jewel box. What he saw in there, Menelaus never found out. But whatever it was, drove Demophon insane. He mounted a horse, drew his sword, and with a wild yell charged towards a cliff. The horse had more sense. When it realised its crazy rider wanted it to jump over the cliff, it stopped abruptly. Demophon flew over its head, broke his neck on the ground, and died. Back in Thrace, Phyllis died of a broken heart. But the immortals transformed her into an almond tree. Each year, when the bare almond tree blossoms, people call the new green leaves Phila, after faithful Princess Phyllis. Back in Cyprus, Menelaus buried Demophon and then resumed his search for Helen. But that is a story for another evening. Aeneas, Prince of Troy and son of Aphrodite, settled in Italy, where he became an ancestor of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. His story is told in Virgil's Aeneid. The Roman belief that they were descended from the Trojan royal family may be one reason why some of their writers have a bias against Odysseus, because it was Homer who credits Odysseus with the fall of Troy in the opening lines of the Odyssey. Tell me of the man, O Muse, the man of twists and turns, who was driven to wander to the ends of the earth after he had sacked the holy citadel of Troy. Troy never rose again, but the Trojan War, its causes, its fall and its aftermath, is one of the most famous events of all time. Homer built his two mighty epics around it. Poets, writers, storytellers and artists through the generations continue to draw inspiration from the events of that war. I'm going to finish with a poem by Alice Oswald. It's a verse that's contained in her book of verse headed Memorial, the excavation of the Iliad. And Hector died like everyone else. He was in charge of the Trojans, but a spear found out the little patch of white between his collarbone and his throat, just exactly where a man's soul sits, waiting for his mouth to open. He always knew it would happen. He who was so beautiful and anxious, and used to nip home deafened by weapons, to to stand in full armour in the doorway, like a man rushing in, leaving his motorbike running. All women loved him. His wife was Andromache. One day he looked at her quietly. He said, "I know what will happen." And an image stared at him of himself dead and her in Argos, weaving for some foreign woman. He blinked and went back to his work. Hector loved Andromache, but in the end he let her face slide from his mind. He came back to her sightless, strengthless, expressionless, asking only to be washed and burned, and his bones wrapped in soft cloths and returned to the ground. Thank you.
Very good.